Hello?
Hello.
Andrew Bacevich. Hi, David Frum here.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. I've done this a few times. I'm not sure if this is your first time on Blogging Heads, or if you spoken here before.
Second time.
Second time. So then you need no introduction. Everybody knows your work, I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you, and I look forward to batting around some ideas and joining the discussion with the Blogging Heads community.
Good.
And I also have a small apology to make to that community, because the last time I was on with Joe Klein, there were a lot of comments about the quality of the sound and video. So we've tried to make some improvements, and I hope it will be better this time.
How should we begin?
Why don't you tell me, we're going to talk about Afghanistan, I think. Why don't you tell me, you have thought very profoundly about questions of American power in connection with American foreign policy goals. Why don't you share with me for a few minutes your thoughts about where we are in Afghanistan, and then we can proceed to where we should be going.
Okay. I think I find myself in disagreement with what I take to be the prevailing assumption about Afghanistan among most analysts. I think most analysts begin from the premise that Afghanistan constitutes a vital national security interest of the United States, and as such, the investment of enormous quantities of blood and treasure can be justified. My own view is that although we have interest in Afghanistan, they are actually quite specific and quite limited, and that we can and ought to try to accomplish those interests without taking a war that is already 8 years long and making it into a war that is going to be 15 years long. So a basic issue from my point of view is exactly how important is this place to us?
Well, I don't know that there are very many people who would say that Afghanistan is a vital interest of the United States. I think the conventional view, certainly would be my view, is it would be hard to imagine a place that was less of vital interest. Nobody would ever have imagined that the United States, in the ordinary course of events, would make any kind of major commitment to Afghanistan. There's a lot of criticism, in fact, because the United States in the 1990s, reasonably from my point of view, did not make a major commitment to Afghanistan after the end of the war with the proxy war with the Soviet Union there. So this wasn't America's idea to go into Afghanistan. It was a response to events that struck America from inside Afghanistan. Where we are now, though, however, is not leaving behind a disaster, not leaving behind an unstable situation in Afghanistan, is a big interest of the United States, maybe not a vital one. And we have learned from hard experience that the small footprint approach to Afghanistan isn't very successful. We've been trying the classic counterterrorism method of looking for the most dangerous people and trying to kill them without worrying too much about the straight structure in Afghanistan. That has been unsuccessful. It's been degrading, and the situation has become critical in the past 18 months, to the point where now the leaders in the United States, President Obama, are proposing to import into Afghanistan the counterinsurgency tactics, which you know well, which have been reasonably successful in Iraq, and to stabilize the country as a predicate for achieving America's interests. Because the alternatives, although you'd like to spend less, aren't going to work at all.
Yeah, I guess that's where we disagree. I guess I understand the willingness to spend a few $100 more billion to somehow derive from an expectation that success in Afghanistan, if achieved and however defined, is going to make any appreciable dent in the jihadist threat.
All right.
And I myself, frankly, don't see that. I don't believe that the jihadist threat is focused or concentrated in Afghanistan. And my own reading of the events of the past 8 years is that an effort to eliminate, control, reduce jihadism, relying on American military power, is likely to have the unintended consequence of actually exacerbating that threat.
All right, well, let's war game it your way. So what would you do starting now, and what results would you reasonably expect to see coming from the actions you propose?
Okay. I'll try to get to your question. As a matter of fact, I will get to your question. But what I would insist rather vehemently is that Afghanistan really is not the big question. And I understand that Washington obsesses about what should we do about Afghanistan. But it really is I think, a second-order issue. The first-order issue, I think, really relates to the question of what's the American strategy at this point, for dealing with the jihadist threat. I would credit the Bush administration with conceiving of such a strategy in the wake of 9/11. My understanding of what the Bush administration intended was that through the use of American hard power, not exclusively hard power, some soft power, but relying a lot on American hard power, the United States would be able to trigger a process of transformation that would ultimately eliminate the conditions in the Islamic world giving rise to terrorism. I think your book with Richard Pearl really was one of the places where that argument was advanced most forcefully. Now, I thought that was a mistaken, defective notion, but I would at least credit the Bush administration with having a concept, with having an idea. I mean, had we been able to trigger that process of transformation, ultimately perhaps it could have reduced the jihadist threat. But from my point of view, taking Afghanistan and Iraq together, that project has failed. We don't have enough power to bring about that transformation. And yet, the question that the Bush administration confronted the day after 9/11 remains. What are we going to do, not to Afghanistan, what are we going to do to reduce or eliminate the jihadist threat? So the answer to that question is the one that demands urgent attention. And from my point of view, it's only after you answer that first question that you can then, in a realistic way, go on to say, well, okay, then where does Afghanistan fit into this larger strategy or larger plan? If we collectively continue to obsess about Afghanistan, it seems to me that prior question gets ignored. And we will continue in the circumstance where we are right now, and that is to be in a strategic void where the so-called long war continues, but we really have no sense of where the long war is headed. So that's point number one. Point number two, again, I really don't think it's the question, what to do about Afghanistan. I would say that our interests there are narrowly confined to needing to prevent Afghanistan from providing a sanctuary to al-Qaeda. As I recall, about 3 weeks ago, General Jones, the National Security Advisor, said that there may be as few as several hundred al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan. And I would argue that some combination of a counterterrorism approach, a well-resourced counterterrorism approach, and an effort to outsource security to Afghan warlords by providing them incentives to keep al-Qaeda out. Some combination of that approach could probably accomplish our limited interest there more cheaply than the McChrystal comprehensive counterinsurgency.
So you're prepared to accept as subservient to our largest strategic goals, leaving behind quite a chaotic situation in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan is not a nice place. It's never been a nice place, and I don't think we have the capacity to make it into a nice place. So if that's what chaos is, then I suspect there will be substantial violence. Whether or not it will be sort of continuous chaos, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I don't want. I want to do justice to both halves of what you're trying to say, but because right now we are consumed with this debate about whether to send additional thousands of American troops on top of the tens of thousands of Americans and NATO forces that are there, that maybe we can weave in the strategic argument into the urgent argument of what now. I mean, if President Obama said send more troops, you would say no. In fact, begin to make preparations to withdraw the ones that are already there.
No, honest to God, and I'm not trying to be stubborn here, but what I would say is, Mr. President, you need to stop having meetings about Afghanistan. You need to start having meetings in which your national security team will help you identify what are the core principles that are informing U.S. strategy that will deal with the problem of jihadism. And Mr. President, if you indeed give into this impulse to obsess about Afghanistan, and there's every indication that's exactly what he's doing, then your administration will continue to have no strategy. You'll have a long war, so-called. He's certainly going to run for re-election based on his record in Afghanistan, assuming that he does some variant of the options that are on the table. But he won't have a strategy. And I think that's a tragedy for the United States of America at this stage of the game, to not have a strategy.
Well, look, there's an Obama-specific question and an America-specific question. The Obama-specific question, what you're saying is catnip to me on that point. I mean, it seems to me that his basic conception of how to deal with jihadism is that the jihadists are the violent and extremist fringe of a large movement with basically reasonable and appeasable goals. And so if we can somehow find out what is bothering large numbers of people in the Islamic world, assuage that grievance, then the jihadists will almost fall away. And
I think you're giving him more credit for having thought through the problem than I see evidence of.
But Afghanistan is a commitment that doesn't consist with that. But my view, and it's kind of a dark view, is that he is in Afghanistan for political reasons, because of the needs of first the Democratic primary and then the general election. And he needed to find a war to be for, but that his actual strategy is is that he rejects the very conception of this as a war. And that's why he's in a mess, because if it had been left up to him, he would never have made this commitment. But he felt obliged, and he's got this commitment, and it doesn't consist with the rest of his thinking and feeling.
See, David, if Senator McCain had won and had been president, I would imagine, I don't know, I would imagine that any debate over how to go forward in Afghanistan would have been much more abbreviated, that McCain probably would have welcomed the McChrystal approach and probably would have quickly approved it. But from my point of view, McCain still would have faced the same larger problem. That is, the larger problem left by the failure of what was formerly called the freedom agenda. I mean, the notion that we could engineer fundamental change across the Islamic world and thereby eliminate the conditions giving rise to terrorism. I mean, maybe you and I disagree. I think that the failure of the freedom agenda at this point is irrefutable.
No,
and it's from that point of view that I'm making the argument that there is this strategic void not created by Obama, but inherited by Obama.
Let me speak up for the freedom agenda, because I think it's on to something very important. And I think one of the things that went wrong with it was that as President Bush always had an instinct, whenever he was in trouble, to double his bet. And so when he was in trouble in 2004 and 5, what he ended up doing, especially in that Second State of the Union, was stating his freedom agenda in such an extreme way as to discredit it. And I was very unhappy about the second inaugural at the time, and wrote and have often said that this is a thing that is going to be thrown in the teeth of those of us who advocated these ideas, because when you state any ideas to their uttermost extreme, those ideas, nothing's perfectly true, at least in the world of national security, and everything has caveats and exceptions and qualifications. But here's my defense of it. If you begin with the idea that that the problem of Islamic extremism that we confront is actually a Pakistan-centered problem as much or more as an Arab world-centered problem. And that,
yeah, I guess we invaded the wrong country back in 2003. Then,
I think one of the things that was implicit in that famous Paul Wolfowitz comment about the Iraq being the line of least resistance was, I think it was true that one of the reasons that we ended up focusing so much on Iraq was that for powerful institutional reasons, that we couldn't think very hard about Saudi Arabia and we couldn't think very hard about Pakistan. I think that. That doesn't make me very happy, but that was the way the United States government worked, and so that's one of the reasons that Iraq came to the fore in the way that it did. And I know that this is a subject in which you have deep personal wounds, and I feel for that, and I want to be respectful of that as we talk about this. But
let's go back to your point that if the big If the problem is centered in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia,
well, especially the failure of the Pakistani state. I mean that what we are witnessing, we are coping all over the world with the consequences of the failure of the authoritarian Pakistani state that had only a sectarian basis, that never rested on the consent of the government, that always had a sectarian basis, that was always an authoritarian state. And that is the state that is now trapped, that, as we are learning more and more about every day, and as President Bush tried to say in 2002 and 2003, is the epicenter of the trade and the traffic in nuclear weapons to radical and dangerous regimes. They were the people behind the Taliban. Without their support, al-Qaeda could never have got the lodgment in Afghanistan that it did. And when we're thinking about, if you want to think in political terms and on the highest level of generality, how does the jihadist problem ever end? It doesn't end until Pakistan becomes a normal country, and that's going to require big doses of freedom.
So, as a supporter of the freedom agenda, in light of what's happened over the past 8 or so years, how would you propose resuscitating or implementing the vision of the freedom agenda going forward?
Well, I think I would first focus. I would break it into two pieces: the Arab piece and the South Asian piece. And the South Asian piece depends on brokering a better relationship between Pakistan and India, and getting the government of Pakistan out of the business of sponsoring terrorism as a way of asserting its national identity. One of the things Richard Pearl and I talked about in our book was, we cut free trade deals with Pakistan, but we never insisted that Pakistan integrate economically with India as part of integrating with the United States, and that should be part of it. We should be thinking about economic integration of South Asia as a crucial step toward building a more normal Pakistan.
How do you? I mean, I'm not trying to get you down into the weeds here, but I mean, how do you do that? Well, I mean, given the conditions that exist, how do you?
Well, we did negotiate a free trade agreement with Pakistan. Is a huge textile exporter, and by the way, they at least until this crisis hit, they had starting in 2002, they had actually something of an economic takeoff, driven in part by sales of textiles to the United States, which is a great thing. All for it. But we should have been doing something. Fine, we're happy to talk trade with you. We want you to talk trade with India. We want you to broker security measures with India. We want you.
But David, this is like saying, there are people who mostly, I think, are on the other side of the political spectrum from you, who I think engage in a vast oversimplification and say, by God, why doesn't the United States of America just go grab those Israelis and Palestinians and get them to make peace?
Right.
Because if that happens, I'm sure the Islamic problem will be solved. This sounds like a variation on that theme. We're going to go grab those Indians and Pakistanis by the scruff of the neck and get them to sort things out. It just seems to me that that vastly overestimates our influence.
For two things, it may overestimate our influence, but the way this is different from the Israeli-Palestinian problem, in this case, is we actually have a regime that has a very close relationship with the United States, which Pakistan has historically had, that is a direct state sponsor of terrorism.
Oh, David, please, come on. I mean, the U.S.-Pakistani, well, from my point of view, the U.S.-Pakistani relationship has been one of many ups and downs, and it has been driven, I'm sorry to say, for the most part, by whatever the United States at a particular moment deems to be expedient behavior.
Right.
If I were a Pakistani, I would never trust the Americans because from the Pakistani perspective, we have repeatedly used them and abused them. I mean, even in the wake of 9/11, for reasons of expediency, we hopped in bed with a military dictator who came to power by engineering a military coup, and President Bush entertained General Musharraf at the White House and proclaimed him to be our great friend. Now, you know and I know why he did that in an immediate sense of relative to Afghanistan, but we cannot come at Pakistan from a position of claiming any sort of credibility with regard to the Pakistan.
I say, actually, I put it a different way. They have used and abused their relationship with the United States, including incubating their pet regime, the Taliban, incubated Al-Qaeda. And that's one of the reasons why they yielded on all these territorial questions when they were confronted by Richard Armitage and Colin Powell after 9/11. We have, and today they are under threat. Their own state is under threat from the consequences of their own actions. So the terrorist groups that they have long either supported or indirectly supported or protected, they're now waging war against the Pakistani state. And maybe there is nothing we can do about that. Maybe they are going to consent to commit suicide. But we have got a big. When you say what role does freedom have in the war against jihadism, that as Pakistan becomes more like a normal country, as it acquires a normal national identity, as it gets out of the terrorism sponsorship business, as it becomes more, and all the things that are likely to happen if it becomes more democratic and the influence of the army and the security forces is reduced to normal proportions, it's going to become less of a source of menace to international relations and less of a source of backing for these jihadist groups, some of which we're struggling with in Afghanistan, but by the way, some of which have taken off all over the planet. And the freedom agenda, the freedom agenda was, I think, a little like what you were saying at the beginning of the conversation about your point of view. It was always better as diagnosis than it was as prognosis. That it wasn't, obvious which admixtures of democracy were going to make the problem better. But I just think it's glaring that it is the distortions caused by authoritarian regimes exploiting nationalism that have and then perverting religious feeling that are so fundamental to incubating this idea that terrorism can be a normal tactic of politics.
Well, we certainly see things differently. I have to say that, God knows I'm all for democracy, and I would love to see Pakistan become, as you described it, a normal state.
More like a normal state.
Well, more like a normal state. Anybody would welcome that. But I guess I would argue that the jihadist problem goes beyond the question of democracy versus authoritarianism, that it really reflects an internal struggle, internal to the Islamic world, to come to terms with modernity and to reconcile religious belief with modernity. And that was a challenge for within what used to be called Christendom. Took a long time to sort out. Much blood was shed along the way. In my own sense, it's going to take an equally long time to be sorted out in the Islamic world, and there already has been and there will be more bloodshed along the way. Our interest, I think, is where we can on the margins, try to promote that reconciliation with modernity, but recognizing it's only on the margin. And in the meantime, try to insulate ourselves from the adverse consequences. I think one of my fundamental problems with the freedom agenda and the notion that the freedom agenda can be advanced using American hard power is that it fails to take into account the extent to which the use of American hard power promotes a backlash, exacerbates the problem, and rather than making us more secure, at least in the near term, makes us less secure, and does so at enormous cost. I mean, there are people who throw around various numbers for what the long war has cost the United States up to this point, but I don't think that $1 trillion and counting is an irresponsible estimate, and certainly it's cost us the lives of well over 5,000 American soldiers. So I don't know how long you would say the long war is going to last. I think that those who see counterinsurgency as the means whereby we will use American hard power would say that the war is going to last a generation or more. That's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost a lot of lives. It's going to require enormous reservoirs of public support. And one of the bases for evaluating the viability of any strategy is whether or not the resources exist to actually see it through. I don't think we have the resources.
Well, let me start by agreeing with some of the things you said at the beginning of that last intervention. I certainly agree that jihadism is about the encounter of traditional Islam with modernity. I don't think jihadism is a form of traditional Islam at all. I mean, traditionally Islam was famously politically quietist. And I think, as you said about Europe, we need some humility here because, other major civilizations, the European one, and let's not forget the Chinese, and their encounters with modernity have probably spilled a lot more blood over extremist ideologies than the Arab and Islamic world have done. The Chinese had a deviation through a communist experiment that is more horrific than anything imagined by the jihadists, and the extremist ideologies we unleashed, communism and Nazism, were pretty nasty and deadly viruses too. So this seems to be a common human problem, and it's connected with maybe someday we may call the adolescence of the human race. But in the meantime, the fact is they are making this transition, and it's not the world of 1935 or even 1955 anymore. This is a world in which transportation is very easy, in which the means of destruction are ready to hand, and that the idea that you could isolate yourself from this, especially since we get so much of our energy from that part of the world.
I used the word insulate, not isolate.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Well, you might be able to insulate it. I mean, there are insulation mechanisms we can take, and a lot of them have been taken. I mean, you can you can make, but they also those insulation mechanisms have cost too. You can make travel more difficult. You can take fewer foreign students. You can restrain immigration, especially from those parts of the world. And a lot of these steps are things underway. Some of them are probably we probably have more success to squeeze out of them than we've already done. But the fact is that's where the oil comes from. A lot of people travel there, and it's a big portion of humanity. And they move. They are not going to be confined inside there. And even if we can make it very difficult, more difficult for jihadists to strike the continental United States and American territories, that we have a lot of friends and interests around the world who are vulnerable, who also, by the way, now have in Europe large Muslim populations inside their own territories. And we also have, I think, to consider that even if we could confine it to within its own boundaries, that these are boundaries in which nuclear weapons are becoming more and more prevalent. That Pakistan is a nuclear state. Iran likely looks like on its way. It looks like to becoming one. It's not so insulable.
I'm not And I would not try to argue that somehow what I've suggested offers a perfect solution. I don't think there is a perfect solution.
Well, I'm sure. Actually, you haven't offered a suggestion yet. I mean, you offered an analysis, but I don't want to push you prematurely to this. But I want to hear more specifically and concretely what it is you think we should be doing.
This is on the question of the trying to restore, to address the condition of strategic bankruptcy.
What do you do?
That I believe exists.
You define the problem any way you want, but then tell me, okay, so what's the plan? What do you think we should be doing with whatever you think the problem is starting from now?
Okay. I think, number one, we erect effective defenses. We had none on 9/11. Certainly we have tried very hard to try to remedy that grotesque failure since then, and I would say that deserves to be a continuing priority.
What do you mean by effective defenses?
I mean, make us take our shoes off when we go through the screening mechanism at airports and have our luggage inspected, so that 19 thugs with box cutters can't hijack airplanes and ram them into skyscrapers. I mean, the failure of the federal government and of local governments to provide for basic security on September 11th, 2001 was criminal. And frankly, the criminals got away with it. Nobody was ever really seriously held accountable for this grotesque failure to provide for security of our country.
Well, let me bracket that.
Defending the country.
Okay, let me bracket that as more problematic than maybe you're giving it credit for, but let's go on number two. Okay, so after we harden defenses inside the country and make it more difficult to carry out terrorist operations, then what?
Yeah, then the second thing I think is that we redefine the problem and we abandon the paradigm of a war against terror or a paradigm of a long war. And we not refusing to grant to these thugs the distinction that comes from saying that we're engaged in a war against them. we call a spade a spade. This is an international criminal conspiracy. It is a criminal conspiracy in which the great majority of nations have an interest in suppressing, and we take a leadership role in organizing an international police effort to identify and dismantle and to destroy this international criminal conspiracy. Police here, of course, does not necessarily mean the cops driving around in squad cars here on the Boston University campus, but it means national police forces, intelligence agencies, at times special operations forces from our uniformed military. But it's an approach that does not entail us invading and occupying countries, which, of course, has been one of the central features of the...
Can I hold you to the discipline, though, of talking about what you will do, not what you don't want to do? Because even that we've got 2 points here, and I just want to keep focusing. What would you do? So
that's what I just tried to tell you.
Okay.
I would organize a international posse to take down an international criminal conspiracy, and this would be an effort that I would resource generously and would sustain long enough to destroy Al-Qaeda and similar organizations. That's what I would do.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me press you on these 2 points with greater specificity.
And then the third point I would say is that 2 more points. One is that I would try to think my way through to a strategy of containment. This gets to the insulation piece. It would not be a strategy of containment that would bear comparison with the strategy of containment devised for the Cold War, because the threat is different. But it would be one in which I would try to take whatever actions seemed appropriate to prevent the influence of the jihadists from getting at the West, whether or not that was related to immigration restrictions. Certainly, it would relate to a comprehensive effort to develop alternative sources of energy to reduce the billions of dollars that we're funneling to the Saudis and others, some of which gets diverted to the jihadists. And then finally, again, not anticipating anything more than a marginal effect, I would try to think my way through what sort of programs we could implement that would encourage, modestly, the development of liberal values within the Islamic world. Perhaps cultural exchanges, perhaps student exchanges, perhaps bringing more students to study here, not because I think it would have a transformative effect, but it could have a useful effect on the margins.
Okay. All right, now I'm going to press you to be a little bit more specific on a couple of these things and I think some of them through together. Defending the United States is an extremely complicated problem because we're not just having to focus on airplanes. I mean, yeah, it's true. After each attack, I mean, I think a lot of our defense measures exist as perpetual monuments or museums to past jihadist efforts. But you and I don't want to talk about this on the phone, but you and I could think of half a dozen plots that could be carried out that don't involve airplanes at all.
Right.
And that would, and where any effort to anticipate those plots would involve constraints on the freedom of Americans to come and go, on a scale that make the taking the shoes off exercise seem negligible. And if we really want to live in a situation, if we're really going to harden the United States and even more Western Europe, that the defense measures are going to be very extreme. Do you disagree with that?
I probably do. I mean, I would not want to. You did not say, but you're creating a picture that somehow suggests that we're living in a Big Brother kind of atmosphere.
Well,
I would not want to assume that would be the result.
What would you have to do to harden London against something like the 7/7 attacks? Just think about what is involved in that. I mean, do you search every backpack that goes on a bus?
David, I'm not in my profession is not one that relates to the specifics of security. There are people who do that for a living. I would want to challenge them to provide me with the best possible plan, probably with a variety of plans. Give me a sense of what we can do and how much money it costs, and also the degree to which the particular option would compromise the exercise of freedom in a particular society. And you do an assessment and you take a certain amount of risk. I'm not trying to tell you it would be simple. I'm just trying to tell you that my preference would be to explore that option rather than invading and occupying countries at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars and the loss of thousands of American lives. When that effort, it seems to me, is unlikely to yield any definitive solution to the problem we agree about.
Okay, I completely accept that you are opposed to invading other countries. I've got that. But I want to now sort of go through the alternative strategy because this is a real threat, and as you agree, the security people, when you talk to them, they're not super optimistic that they can do very much about this. I mean, they think that through intelligence and surveillance, all of these steps are also very controversial. As we discover in the Bush administration, a lot of the things they did to do surveillance turned out to be some of the most inflammatory actions of that administration. That the NSA program was at least as explosive as it. Well, not as explosive as well.
No question about it. That it raises very sensitive issues that relate to civil liberties, and that therefore it complicates politics because these civil liberties issues engender emotional responses, and they need to get sorted out. That's just politics.
Well, let's go to your second point. Let me just lay down that when people think that this is a straightforward, the second thing is the international police action to weed this out. So let's think about how that would work. That a team of guys come from Pakistan, attack the most visible hotel in Bombay, or actually an even more spectacular example. At the end of 2001, a team of guys come from Pakistan and attack the Indian Parliament. And they leave the fingerprints of forces associated with security forces in Pakistan all over the effort. And that latter one, in December 2001, that nearly culminates in a nuclear war, in a war between India and Pakistan that could well have gone nuclear. I mean, how do you imagine an international police force working? I mean, the problem is that the place where there are a lot of the people you want to cooperate with are in fact the culprits. I mean, the Saudis used to be, I think they're largely out of the game of direct support for Hamas. the Iranians are very much in the game of direct support for Hezbollah, and the Pakistanis are in and out of the game of direct support for all kinds of bad actors.
Are out of the game?
In and out of the game. They go in, they go out.
I'm sorry. So is the question, what are we going to do about Pakistan?
No. The question is when you say the answer is a coordinated international effort to use police measures to uproot these terrorist groups. I mean that's. I want to hear more about how that's going to work, because that seems a very complicated proposition that.
It is a very complicated proposition. It's not a proposition that, in a sense, by next Tuesday we have all the measures in place and they're guaranteed to success. On the other hand, I would say that the Freedom Agenda's plans to make Pakistan into a more normal nation would also qualify as a pretty complicated proposition.
But without the Freedom Agenda, it's hard to see how you get Pakistan to cooperate at all. I mean, the thing is, the thing you want to do depends on the success of the normalization of Pakistan and countries like it. I mean, the idea that you're going to mobilize this Iranian government to cooperate with you in uprooting terrorist operations performed by the government of Iran, that seems kind of unrealistic.
Well, if we're shifting the conversation to Iran, which I'm glad to do, I would suspect that you and I may differ about the proximate Iranian threat, and we'd probably differ about the way forward in Iran. My own sense of Iran would be that actually Iran may well offer us the one glimmer of hope with regard to the long-term prospects of our struggle with violent Islamism. Because what we see in Iran as the first, I think, of the Islamic revolutions, we see a revolution that has emphatically failed, that a regime that has little legitimacy, that clings to power by its fingertips, evidence of a people who yearn for modernity. And it seems to me that it's quite likely that the Iranian, the internal processes of change within Iran will actually perhaps ultimately provide a better indication of the positive direction within the Islamic world than anything that the United States imagines it can possibly engineer from the outside. There's big change going on in Iran, and I would say that on balance, most of that change is likely to be positive.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that, because I think I do agree with that. One of the, that's not why I'm delighted. I'm delighted to hear saying this is important and interesting, but as it happens, I also agree with that. But that goes back to my point about whatever you think about the Freedom Agenda as a set of recommendations, as a diagnosis of where extremism comes from and where violence comes from. That the diagnosis is very powerful. If these societies are encountering modernity unsuccessfully and are then responding to that encounter with authoritarianism and violence, and if there's no going back, then there's only going forward toward becoming completely modern.
And they're going to do it their own way in their own time.
Yeah, but in a world of jet travel and briefcase bombs, we have it's not something where you can say, oh, well, you take your time, and if you have to go through the Cultural Revolution, you do, and if you have to have a nuclear shooting war with your neighbors, you do, and if, by the way, you extrude millions of your young people as economic refugees, and they come to our cities and become violent and blow up our subways, that's all in a day's. I mean, we are interested parties. It's become a very, very small planet, and I think that's really the difference now. Even certainly if you compare it to what happened in China, that actually was confined within the boundaries of a single political entity. Well, actually not quite. Actually, did spill over, but at least one region of the world. We didn't have Maoists blowing themselves up in London.
I'm sorry.
I said we didn't have Maoists blowing themselves up in London. It was hard. It was hard to get from Shanghai to London in 1955, in 1965. But these things spill over. I mean, the idea, the insulation idea, is in its way as troublesome. I mean, which is not to say that the freedom idea is easy or that it's always worked, and a lot of it has gone wrong. But
maybe it doesn't work.
Well, the point is, your own analysis of what's going on in Iran points to it as the ultimate answer. And what you're actually, it sounds like what you're saying is we don't have
because the freedom agenda as implemented by the Bush administration did not work on the assumption that people in the Islamic world were going to be permitted to find their own path to modernity. It was premised on the assumption that we could shove modernity down their throat, which is what we tried to do in Iraq, which is what we are trying to do in Afghanistan. You and I might differ to some degree about the success that we have achieved in Iraq. I would argue rather strongly that given what the effort has cost us thus far, Iraq and Afghanistan really don't provide much of a template to be applied elsewhere in the Islamic world, and that what to the extent that there is a move toward reconciling with modernity that's happening within Iran, I would credit that to Iranians, would not claim a lot of credit for anything that the United States or the West generally has done to advance that process.
Well, I think that in the case of Iran, I think that's largely true with a lot of important exceptions, including by the way, the prospect of elections next door. I'm not an Iranian, I don't know, but people who do know more suggest to me that has had a big impact, that seeing people vote next door has had a big impact on, and knowing that the votes in Iraq, for all of Iraq's faults, the votes were honestly counted. In Iran, they're not, and that had its impact. But if we're agreeing that this is about the transition to a more modern way of life, and if we're agreeing that that's going to be accompanied by violence, I think what we're really disagreeing about is, one, is this something that affects us very much? Should we be worried about the violent way that the Islamic world is having this encounter? And I would argue that we have a very strong interest driven by just the way the modern world works. And the second is, are we able to do anything about it? And you can believe that we have an interest and not believe that we can do anything about it. But if we have an interest, we need to at least look for things we can do about it. And this has been something that we, as I said, I mean, you look at China, which is making this kind of transition. We haven't had a lot of influence there. It's a huge place, and yet through the power of example, through containment, as you say in that case, containing them, but also defeating them on battlefields when they did try to use military power.
Oh, gracious sakes! What battlefields were those?
Vietnam and Korea.
Well, my recollection of the way Korea worked is that it was when the United States recklessly and foolishly advanced north of the 38th parallel, ignoring warnings from the Chinese that they would view that as a threat to their own security, that we induced the Chinese to intervene, and it was a disastrous miscalculation on the part of the Truman administration. They weren't looking for an opportunity to go to war with the United States.
As you'll recall, the reason we were in a position to approach.
Are you telling me that the Vietnam War, was about containing the Chinese? You think that really?
Here's what I'll say about Korea. You'll recall that the reason that the United States was in the vicinity of the Yalu River was because a Chinese ally had in the first place crossed the 38th parallel. So whether or not we went too close to the border in our counterattack, which is an interesting question. I don't have strong views about it. It wasn't that this was a war we started, and it was a military test, and it did involve our relationship both with the Soviet Union and with China, which were allies at the time. And in Vietnam, it was absolutely an obsessive fear of China that was driving the United States to believe that
one of the things that was driving us was an obsessive fear with China.
Right.
But the Vietnam War was not about China. The Vietnam War was a Chinese was a Vietnamese civil war. We
was
completely misconstrued what the war was about, and lost 58,000 American lives for next to nothing.
We were terrified in '65, and with good reason, that the radical ideology that had gained power in China in 1949 could spread elsewhere in Asia. It nearly happened in Indonesia. In
1965, David, the Sino-Soviet split had already occurred, and policymakers in Washington either lacked the wit or, I'm sorry to say, the courage to acknowledge that and to evaluate the implications. And the implications, of course, which Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger ultimately did acknowledge and respond to, the implications were monumental in terms of simply understanding the adversary. In other words, the whole notion of a monolithic communist world was exposed as a delusion, and the refusal to recognize the Sino-Soviet split then creates a barrier to seriously evaluating the stakes in Southeast Asia, and therefore leading us to embark upon this war that was unnecessary and wasteful. I would say that, to look at something like Vietnam should chasten us today, and should caution us against the worst case analysis. Unless we employ American military power, that we're doomed.
Let me just because this is an argument that's well known and familiar, but I would just caution that one of the things that is a real occupational hazard in thinking about history is we never know what lay down the door, the path that we didn't take, and this, for example, as we are watching governments right now struggle to avert a Great Depression, a new Great Depression. We think back on the statesmen and financiers of 31, 32. If they had been successful in stopping the Great Depression in 31, which they might have happened, they would never have known what they stopped. In the same way, when we look at Southeast Asia in '65, Vietnam was obvious. It was a debacle. I'm not going to argue with you about that. That's obvious. But it was not completely crazy. In fact, it was very right and smart for American statesmen in '65 to say, Mike, that the Chinese world is going through, and the East Asian world generally, and all the countries that are influenced by Chinese culture are going through this radical spasm. And it's reaching not just into Vietnam, but also into Indonesia, which is a country where there was another bloodbath. This one where America was able to stay out of it, thank heaven.
Sorry, David, you're reviving the domino theory?
I am talking that people have, the statesmen of the past, who are not fools,
some of them were.
Who are no more foolish than we are, and who had to make their decisions from the same palette of misinformation and blocked understanding. They had to confront this problem. They had to confront it in Europe in the 1930s. They had to confront it in East Asia, and we're now having to confront it in the Islamic world.
You're much more empathetic, I think.
Than I am. I think that's a sarcastic remark.
No, it's not a sarcastic remark. I think you were suggesting a certain empathy for the decision makers of the 1960s and the extent to which they were, of course, dealing with incomplete information, which of course is one of the occupational hazards, I guess, of statecraft. And I was simply going to say, I'm not empathetic. I think that there's plenty in the record to show, specifically we're talking about Vietnam here, I think, to show an absence of courage, a refusal to, look at facts in the face, a recklessness when the decision makers themselves were unlikely to, in a personal sense, bear the costs of their decisions. Simply take, for example, the U.S. complicity in the decision to overthrow Diem, which culminated in his assassination and the complete destabilization of politics in Saigon. I don't feel any empathy at all for the people who engineered that action.
Well, we're going to take it as we confront the problem of what do you do about a Hamid Karzai. I think that the problem they face with ZM has some resonance. And
it does. I agree.
And if they and we can, as Lincoln said at the end of the Civil War, we can take the example of the past as something to learn wisdom from. But we're coming to the end of our time. I want to say one thing. I hope we'll have a chance to talk again, because I have to say I want to hear more about what you had to say, because I didn't find this. I don't feel like I've had a completely satisfactory understanding of what you were actually proposing that we do. And I'm not quite sure, even at the end of this hour, what exactly we're disagreeing about. Whether we're disagreeing that the problem is serious, whether you're disagreeing that we have any reason to be concerned about how it will affect us, or whether we're having a disagreement about modalities. Because the program you laid out in those moments we're talking about, it struck me as not as articulated and refined and complete as I would like to hear before having. If I were a decision maker, I'd like to have much more concrete detail, and maybe we'll have a chance to do it again. But I'm prepared to acknowledge that a lot of the approach that, as I said, that I've advocated has been stronger in its assessment and diagnosis than in its prognosis, and there have been a lot of problems along the way, and things haven't always worked very well. But if the problem is serious, then we're going to have to come up with some alternatives, and they're going to have to be implementable, as you would say.
Right.
All right. Well. So on that inconclusive note, I'll look forward to resuming this at some time if you've got the chance to do it.
You betcha. It's good to talk to you.
Okay. Pleasure talking to you. Bye-bye.